Thank you.
Fine. I now welcome representatives from Toyota Australia. I understand you've both been given information on parliamentary privilege and
Sorry, Senator.
Yes.
Sorry, Senator. We also have Simone Zerial here as well, representing Toyota.
Good morning. Okay, in the room with you.
Correct. That's right.
No worries.
We are having some technical difficulties at our end. We can hear you and you can hear us, but we don't have any video for any participants.
Okay, we can continue like this provided you're comfortable with that, depending on, we often conduct these hearings just by video.
Or telephone.
Just by telephone. Would you like are you comfortable continuing?
I think as long as all parties can hear each other, I think that's fine, Senator.
And look, feel free to draw my attention as chair to anything that you need to clarify or didn't hear.
Thank you.
So I invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of your remarks, I'll invite members of the committee to ask questions. If I can ask the three of you, starting with you, Mr. Callaghan, and then with you, Mr. Willis, and I think it's, can I just write down your name, Simone? It's
Zerial is the surname. Z-E-R. Yeah, I-A-L.
Okay, so if all three of you can introduce yourself separately to the committee, and then I'm assuming it's you, Mr. Callaghan, who's making an opening statement. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and then you may proceed with an opening statement.
Sure. Matthew Callaghan, President and CEO, Toyota Motor Corporation Australia.
Mr. Willis?
Andrew Willis, Manager for External Affairs, Toyota Australia.
Simone Zerial, General Counsel, Toyota Australia.
Thank you. Please proceed with your opening statement.
Thank you, Senator. Look, I thank the committee for inviting me here today to provide an update on Toyota Australia. Toyota Australia appreciates the opportunity to address the committee investigating the regulation of the relationship between all car manufacturers and car dealerships in Australia, which we understand to be an extension of the original forum that was focused on General Motors Holden in Australia. Before we go to open discussion, I'd like to take just a couple of moments to provide some background on Toyota Australia and recap our stance on the matters raised by this committee. Toyota Australia is a sales and distribution operation, having previously also manufactured vehicles in Australia for 54 years until the 3rd of October 2017. Toyota Australia has just reached a significant milestone this year, celebrating 60 years of operation, and it should be noted that we retained a significant local presence in Australia beyond the closure of local manufacturing. Toyota continues its local presence with close to 1,600 employees, offices throughout Australia, and continues to provide a strong contribution to society with extensive links to the community. In relation to our continuing business focus, in addition to our import and distribution activities, Toyota Australia also maintains a significant research and development division, has established a centre of excellence at our Altona site, which was previously our manufacturing site, is trialling and evaluating zero-emission vehicles such as the Mirai fuel cell vehicles, and is involved in a range of connected mobility initiatives. At Toyota, the decisions we make, the way we treat our employees, dealers and customers are all informed by Toyota's global guiding principles. One of the key pillars is respect for people, which is why it's important that our relationship with our dealers is founded on the same principles. 2020 has been a challenging year, which has accelerated the pace of change. The COVID-19 global crisis has had a significant impact on all aspects of life and has meant that we have needed to reinvent ourselves and the way we interact with our customers, for example, contactless delivery of vehicles. During these challenging times, Toyota continues to focus on respectful engagement with our people and our business partners with a strong emphasis on our dealer network. In terms of Toyota dealer network, it is comprised of some 200 dealers operating across almost 300 sites throughout Australia. To help ensure best practice, the National Toyota Dealer Association was established to support the collaboration between the dealership network and Toyota. The NTDA, as we refer to it, has many functions, including exploring new opportunities, sharing industry learnings, and providing a forum for dealers to raise concerns or complaints without the need for escalation to more formal safeguard measures. Turning your attention to Toyota's presence in the Australian market, in 2019, Toyota maintained our position as the top-selling automotive brand for the 17th consecutive year, and we currently have a year-to-date market share of almost 22%, of which 27% of our vehicles sold were hybrid, low-emission vehicles. The new vehicle market in Australia has changed significantly in the last 35 years, and Australia is now one of the most open and competitive new vehicle markets in the world. In Australia, there are some 69 brands competing for an average of 1 million sales a year, with the highest selling vehicle in 2019 selling just under 48,000 units. In the USA, however, there is a similar number of brands competing for an average of 17 million car sales a year. We could not have predicted the magnitude of change and transformation that has happened over recent years, including the closure of local manufacturing facilities, the shifting focus from vehicle ownership to vehicle usership with the arrival of car share, ride share companies, and the growth in the rise of low and zero emission vehicles and the momentum towards autonomous and connected vehicles. Toyota has traditionally seen itself as a car company. However, this focus has shifted towards being a mobility company. Mobility focus on solutions for all, including connected, autonomous, shared and electric vehicles, as mentioned earlier. In addition, there are broad-ranging disruptions impacting industry, including new, non-traditional players. All of these factors mean we have to work closely with our dealers to ensure a win-win-win outcome for the distributor, the dealer, and the customer. These changes, which are happening globally, go some way to explaining the magnitude of change within the industry and why it is important that regulation does not hinder the evolution of the market and the inevitable changes that occur as a result of market and consumer demand. Over recent years and via several different government channels, the relationship between dealers and manufacturers has been under scrutiny, with the most recent government policy outcome being the franchise code reforms implemented from June this year. Toyota's position has always been there are existing processes in place to address our dealer concerns, and where required, enforcement of the current regulations should be the priority. Given the short time frame since the latest reforms, Toyota believes it is too soon to be considering additional changes to the franchising code, as this increases regulatory burden without allowing time for validation of these changes. Toyota's arrangement with our dealers are built on an integrated relationship and cover complex business arrangements. It should also be noted that our dealers come in different shapes and sizes. However, many are large and well-resourced businesses, often part of group entities. Toyota is intrinsically linked to its dealers, and therefore it is in our collective interest that dealers succeed commercially. Our dealers are the touch points to our customers and our partners in providing mobility solutions. Toyota's success as the top-selling automotive company in Australia for the last 17 years is extremely strongly supported by the strong and symbiotic relationship we have with our dealer network. Toyota deals in large-scale volumes, and we rely heavily on our dealer network as the conduit to the customer. Toyota views our dealer arrangements as partnerships in which no one party can win at the other's expense on a long-term basis. Toyota's approach is to consult closely with the dealer network and collaboratively explore opportunities that benefit the network. Some of the main ways we engage with our dealers are through various local, state, and national forums. For instance, our National Dealer Conference and regular bulletin updates. In line with some of the areas of focus of this inquiry, Toyota has an ongoing, open and transparent relationship with its dealers, in which significant issues around issues such as tenure and compensation are via extensive consultation with the National Dealer Council. While Toyota acknowledges there are changes occurring within the automotive landscape that see other manufacturers considering alternative business models, such as the agency model, Toyota has no change or plans to change its approach. Toyota's business processes and engagement with our dealer network continues to be focused on sustaining and optimizing operations and engagements through to the customer. However, with the significant changes occurring across the sector, only some of which I touched upon briefly, brands will need to be in a position to adapt in line with the market and consumer conditions. We should expect all the disruption to industry, not just automotive, will continue both globally and within Australia, and the market needs to have flexibility to respond. Thank you.
Very much, Mr. Callaghan. And could you just correct me in the pronunciation of your surname?
Callaghan.
Callaghan. No worries. Thank you. Thank you for your evidence this morning. I'm going to commence by asking you very briefly, how do you expect some of the trends to continue to change? And you're asserting that you're seeking to ensure that those commercial trends that might disrupt business will remain compatible with a dealer network. That hasn't been the experience for some OEMs and their dealer networks. But nevertheless, you consider that strong dealer network will help you adapt to that change because it helps you maintain a strong market dominance. Can I ask where you think some of the other brands have gone wrong?
Okay, well, let me firstly address. Into the future, there'll always remain consumers, and they'll always need vehicles. But it may actually morph in terms, as I was saying, to more mobility. There may be a growing component of car sharing and others. What we try and do is to say that, look, because there's always going to be consumers, somebody has actually got to be their main degree of contact or their main person of contact. And so from that viewpoint, we believe, based upon our previous experience and based even upon the trends that we see moving forward, still people want, frankly, a personal relationship with the dealer. A vehicle is a highly complex piece of machinery, and as a result of that, requires servicing and ongoing maintenance and eventual replacement. And so people like the ability to be able to form that relationship. And they need to, that relationship is being very successfully managed by the dealers. So with that as a premises, which will never change, we then have to look about all the disruption in the pipeline that occurs. So from our viewpoint, what we do is that we forecast what we think the market will be, and we forecast basically the trends that we see emerging, not only domestically, but we look at the global situation. We've then put together plans around 2025, and we've explained to our dealers what we see happening and where we see the key areas of focus that we need to be involved with. Then with our dealers, we sit down and we pose ideas about how do we best address this together. Because the reality is no one person or no one group has a moratorium on great ideas. The dealers deal with customers every single day. So they're in the best position also to give us ideas, lots of ideas back. And together through that process and through the subcommittee structure that operates underneath the dealer council, we work on ways and means collaboratively to prepare ourselves for the future.
Take from that, in a sense, that part of the demise of other brands and though is actually because they haven't taken care of those relationships. And I guess it's if you're happy with that business model, I guess it's no skin off Toyota's nose if, for the lack of mandatory arbitration or enforceable principles, that you continue to succeed where others fail. I guess you might also suggest that being forced into do those things won't necessarily save those relationships. Do you think that the demise of the Holden brand was inevitable because they didn't take care of those things along the way? And who bears the responsibility for that?
I'm reluctant to really comment on the competitors, but I think the formula is quite, the other component of all of this is product as well. you're not going to go anywhere if you don't have great products. And so no matter how good your relationship is with your dealers, you're not going to sell anything unless you've got the great product to start with as the underlying base. And ourselves and our dealers discuss that. Toyota's got this extremely strong base of products. And from there, that gives us the leverage then to be able to say, using that to actually take that to the next level. And that's where our relationship with our dealers comes in so importantly. If I go back and sort of, a lot of you probably won't remember this, but the old battle between VHS and Betamax. Betamax was the more superior of the two, but VHS won in the end. And that's how we look at it. We've got a great product range, but the reality is that if we intend to be successful in the marketplace, we have to work with our dealers to leverage that to absolutely capitalise on that opportunity.
And notably, it only won for a little while until the DVDs came
That's
along,
right.
and now we're in the digital.
And then streaming.
The digital streaming online
And
world.
that's exactly the analysis of where the disruption, and it's not only in that industry, it's right the way through every industry. And we're not at all complacent. Ourselves and our dealers are not complacent whatsoever.
And you consider your footprint in your dealers a core part of being able to maintain that adaptability. So can I ask Senator O'Neill, do you now have questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. Indeed, I do. Can I say, first of all, thanks for your submission, which was very carefully constructed and provided to us. Thank you. And for your opening statement, which I think was a very accurate reflection of what was in that opening statement. And can I take the opportunity to congratulate you and Toyota, Mr. Callahor, on what clearly is a very professional and respectful relationship, albeit, a robust business relationship with the dealers who've given evidence this morning. I'm particularly heartened by both your evidence this morning and theirs about mechanisms to enable the complex elements of business to be discussed. You've talked about careful planning for the future and also dispute resolution, about which it doesn't sound like there's been an awful lot of it over the last period. So that's a great credit to Toyota. And I want to take the opportunity to acknowledge the local dealer in the area that I've lived in for most of my married life, Brian Hilton Toyota on the Central Coast, just for the remarkable contribution they've made in community support to so many good causes over the decades that they've been operating. You've submitted that subject to certain conditions being met, it's Toyota's intention to extend the new dealer agreement at the end of the term for a further 5 years. Can you explain what certain conditions would need to be met? Because we've heard a 5-2 model in the evidence so far. What's going on there, Mr. Callahor, and why is that so important?
Sure. We have a relatively new dealer agreement in place that was conducted in and agreed with the Dealer Council, I'd have to say probably in record time for us, over an 18-month period for a highly complex document. And what that document does is that we clarify and transparently notate down KPIs that the dealers are also in agreement with, which are appropriate KPIs in terms of sales performance, profitability, other areas. So what happens is that provides a basis for us to move forward with so that we can have a good conversation between ourselves and our dealers. And then on the basis of that and any special conditions, so for instance, we upgrade our facilities every so often, but in sympathy with whatever the market, if the market isn't going, well, we're not going to do something like that. But you have to actually maintain your presence within Australia. So there are conditions, and sometimes with dealers, when they may change hands, they may move sites physically. So individual dealer conditions may be asked of them, and as part of the agreement for taking on the franchise, it may be that the facility requires some changes that are required to represent the brand. And it's signed off by both sides. So we have a mechanism in place to have a good conversation with the dealer about their ongoing presence in Australia. I should note the thing that we want every dealer to succeed. So we don't use KPIs to beat anybody over the head. And I think if you spoke further to David and also other members of our dealer council, you would find that our conversation really centres about how can we best work with you so that you can achieve these for the benefit of your business to be sustainable in your territory.
I thank you for that answer. Why the 5 years though? Why is that? Why is that the magic number?
I guess it could be any number really, but we felt that within 5 years...
Could it be one?
We don't personally believe in our situation that one is appropriate. We believe it takes time to become involved in the local community. And the reality is, as much as we have disruption, you referred to the Hiltons and Josh Hilton, who is the dealer principal there, and their heavy involvement. It takes time to become an integral part of the community and to become a trusted component of the community. In our case, we don't believe that 1 year will give the dealer the adequate opportunity to prove their business capability. So we have 5 years is what we believe is an appropriate time frame. And most of our planning, to be honest, inside Toyota Australia is on a 5-year cycle. So we look out on 5-year blocks.
So when Mr Mills is making his $17 or $18 million investment in Maroochydore, he indicated that Toyota has some guidance principles and programs that create a second set of valuable eyes to make sure that this is a good investment for him and for Toyota. He would hardly be likely to make that sort of investment on a 1-year contract, would he, Mr Callahor?
No, well, I think in our case, that's why we aren't asking for 1 year in the case of Toyota.
Yeah. Are there particular conditions that you believe, other than the KPIs, that need to be met? Or is it all explicitly provided for in the Toyota assessment model for a renewal?
It's very transparent, the overall KPIs that are required, but dealer by dealer situation, there is also certain conditions and elements. So for instance, it may be that there may have been a changeover in the dealership. So in which case they may be using a different site. So one of the conditions that we agree to jointly with the dealer is it may require refurbishment, it may require changes to the site, and then we sign those. And that's an instance where it's a one-on-one discussion and basically an agreement between both parties, and the dealer agreement is signed.
If I can just go to the KPIs that you mentioned, you said you introduced the new management regime, was it last year?
Yes.
Yes. So what made you change the model that you had, and what are the KPIs that you now use to measure the dealer performance?
I think in the looking forward into the future, and the way all of our plans are predicated is that for the dealer, with all the disruption that is occurring, for both TMCA and the dealer, we have to continue to get better and better in each component of what we are doing. So we felt the more generalised approach to it was not adequate to make sure that the dealer, as well as ourselves, was being, what's the best way to put it, would reflect what was necessary to be successful into the future, which is why we became more clear, and the dealers agreed with us, in terms of being clear on what successful parameters were going to be required to be sustainable for the future.
Could I just ask, with that background on the record, to what do you attribute being the most successful brand in Australia with regard to your dealers? Is it the mechanisms that you've been talking about, or is it something bigger than that?
I think there's quite a few components in place. The first thing is that, as I mentioned, you have to have a product range underlying it, and that product range has to actually live up to the not the hype, but basically the reputation. And so the second thing is that Toyota globally has principles upon which they found themselves, and that's respect for people and also Kaizen or constant improvement. So as a general philosophy, we approach everything that nothing is ever good enough. It can always get better. So, and we talk to our dealers very openly, and they agree with us on this point. Everyone has got to continue to get better. So our relationship with our dealers is built on a common understanding, and that's been a huge benefit.
So is it your evidence, Mr. Callahor, that the relationship with your dealers has a very significant effect on sales and on the success of Toyota?
Correct. Absolutely.
Is the relationship more important than anything else, Mr. Callahor?
I think the relationship is absolutely critical for us to be successful. If I was to say, can I throw out products and just have a relationship, I don't think that would work.
The whole relationship is built on having a good product that you can
Correct.
that you can
Exactly.
both buy into and encourage
Correct.
consumers then to purchase as well.
Correct.
If I could just go to a couple of questions around goodwill and data, Mr. Callahor. According to reports, you emphasise the importance of data in the car retail market. We've had some interesting evidence about data and how it's being captured and transferred and managed. There seem to be very, very different views about who owns the data and a growing sense of its importance and its value. Toyota dealers in their submission state that you acknowledge and recognise that the dealers own the data in the form of goodwill. Is that correct?
I think no one person owns the data. It belongs to the consumer. From that viewpoint, we're custodians of that data. But goodwill is built up through a number of different components, which is basically reputation and involvement in the community. So it's impossible to say data is just a component of, or data is a component of goodwill. It's not the only thing in goodwill.
Okay, but it is a component of it.
Well, it's a component of it in the respect that it actually represents what you've got back from the community.
Okay.
And that goodwill and trust.
So when somebody sells their business to another business, we heard from, I think, Mr. Mills, that there's not a lot of involvement of Toyota Australia in that process. Are you aware that goodwill is part of those transactions of trade between an old owner of a business and a new owner?
We are aware of that.
And that data is part of what is considered goodwill?
It probably is, yes.
Right. Do you agree that the success of a dealership has a lot to do with the quality of the customer data that they have and how they use it?
It's certainly one of the key components is how they actually utilise it, but I think utilise it is a rather clinical term. We've all got lots of data. It's how you actually capitalise, and I mean that in the nicest way, to build the empathy and trust and relationship
with your business.
Customers.
On Thursday we heard here that Honda Australia is taking its most successful dealer in Australia, terminating its business and handing its customer base and sales momentum to another business without paying compensation. The inquiry was told, and I quote, "The goodwill and customer base built up over 50 years of selling and servicing Hondas will be gifted to another business." Would you operate in that way as Toyota, Mr. Callahor?
I'm not about to comment on a competitor because I don't understand the circumstances surrounding the whole picture at all. So in our case, our dealers, when they have a buy and a sell arrangement, they go and talk to whoever they're talking about buying the actual operation. Toyota will vet them in terms of being suitable candidates for the franchise, but we always arrive at a suitable arrangement with the dealer. but I'm reluctant to specifically comment on a competitor.
Can Toyota insist on access to all data, all the dealer acquired data?
Toyota and its dealers have a data sharing arrangement, which is basically an agreement in terms of how best to work with data jointly between the two.
Have you had any disputes about data that you've had to resolve, Mr. Callaghan?
Since we've had the data agreement, none.
Okay, and when was that resolved, that data agreement?
Oh,
You can take it on notice if you want to check the date.
yeah, I'm not sure actually.
That's
I'd
all
have to
right.
take that on notice.
That's fine. I note, and it was put on the record again this morning, that you have an agency model in New Zealand. It was noted that there was a 10-year preparation period to move to that model. What was the rationale for establishing the model, and how does the size of the market in New Zealand compare with that in Australia?
The market is extremely different between New Zealand and Australia. And so, for instance, the major number of vehicles sold are imported used vehicles, and tends to be a very old car park. It's a very different market from the Australian market.
Okay. And do you know why there's an agency model there?
They felt that
Given your indications that you're not going to move to that in Australia.
Yeah, sure. Look, the market itself is so fundamentally different. They felt in New Zealand that the market difference, the way their market and their forecast into the future of disruption and where it was heading, was the agency model would be the most successful way to move for themselves and their dealers into the future.
So
in the case of
it was
Australia,
more negotiated and not imposed. Is that what you're saying, Mr. Callaghan?
I don't know the details,
Okay.
to be absolutely honest. So all I know is the general.
But in terms of Australia, does Toyota have any plans to introduce an agency model in the next 5 years?
No.
Can I draw your attention to the Department of Industry draft voluntary principles for new car dealership agreements, which I believe the Secretariat has sent to you? I note in your submission that your state reform should be the result of coordinated, informed and measured approach in consultation with all relevant stakeholders. Does Toyota Australia acknowledge that the purpose of government regulations is generally to protect the vulnerable? For example, what we saw with the Holden dealers has led to a very significant change to those car distribution businesses. Regulation should not get in the way of successful business operations, but it is there to protect. What are your thoughts about that, Mr. Callaghan?
Firstly, probably, Andrew, did you have a comment?
Well, look, only to say that we're aware that I think from the Department of Industry, there's been some documentation put through and shared with a number of the associations to look at the principles. So we're aware of that and we're working through that. In Toyota's case, and we look at our own business, in that we don't see how that would provide additional value add or safeguard mechanisms necessarily for us or for our network. We've got these long-standing business practices which already go above and beyond some of the previous requirements under the franchise code. And there's also a whole range of other areas which are under study as well, which I think sort of provides additional layers of protection as well. So again, we're not sure in terms of our business, we don't see that it's what the value add is. However, each time we make changes, it does mean that we need to go back and revisit documentation and go through processes. So it takes up a lot of our time and dealer time to generate the new documents just by the legislative requirements without necessarily providing what we would see as a value add.
Yeah, I understand that. And it's often called red tape, but usually it's there for our protection. These things don't emerge in a vacuum. They come when some gross form of exploitation or some terrible accident accident has befallen somebody and the government is called on to respond to an emerging reality. One of the emerging realities is that we've got dealers like Honda Australia and General Motors terminating agreements at very short notice with their business partners, operating a very different model from yourself. And I understand why you might not think that these draft principles are essential for your business as it's currently operating, and I guess Mr. Hayes might agree with you with regard to that. But if everything were to be profoundly disrupted and the business model had to change in a very significant way at short notice, do you concede, Mr. Willis and Mr. Callahor, that there needs to be protection for Australian businesses to ensure that the market is serviced properly? Consumers can be sure that they'll be able to get their warranty met on their cars, and that we keep the great jobs and the training across the country that is part of the network.
Senator Simone Zerial here for Toyota. I believe that there are already a number of protections in place through various different legal mechanisms, including unfair contract terms, legislation which applies, for example, to small business, and which will be the subject of future study and future reform, as recently announced. There are also very recent changes to the franchising code that provide also more safeguards to dealers. So there has been a lot of recent change. They were introduced as recently as June 2020. So I think that there's a lot of movement to protect people that may need protection, and there are existing legal avenues for franchisees to explore in terms of making claims for damages.
Can I say that I do know that what you've described is the government's discussion points really around what they think is happening in this space. Yet we've had submission after submission of them, many of them confidential because they are so frightened of the retribution of their OEM, clearly a very different situation to what you're handling at Toyota, that has said the current changes that are proposed do not provide adequate protection, and the principles that have been considered need to be mandatory. Now, I know that you're here to support Toyota, but with an understanding of the scale of unrest that I'm sure that you're aware of in the whole car provision market in Australia, would Toyota be willing to support their dealers who have made it very clear this morning in their request to government to make the principles proposed mandatory?
I think that, as I understand it, obviously I'm not privy to the drafting of the NTDA's submission, but I believe that their request in terms of mandating rules is in relation to other brands, as they have knowledge of, the operations of other brands, and therefore, as regards Toyota, we remain of our position that further reform is not urgently required.
Because
Can I
your
ask in that
relationship's in a pretty
context-
good place. Sorry, Chair, can I just ask one final one?
Go.
I understand that on the evidence we've received, your relationship with the dealers is in pretty good shape, and they have a high degree of trust in that business relationship they have with you. They are able to compare and contrast that with their peers, and because this industry is so important to the country, there has been support by Toyota dealers for these principles to be made mandatory. If they become mandatory, would Toyota depart the Australian market?
I'm happy to provide initial response, or Matthew, would you like to do that?
We're not leaving Australia.
That's the same answer I would have given.
Well, I'm glad that you concur about that, because that's one of the comments that's been made by the FCAI, and one of the threats is that if mandatory principles were adopted and if mandatory resolution of disputes occurred, that there would be a massive flight of all the OEMs from Australia. How fanciful is that description, Mr. Callahor, in your view, as the leader of the representative of the most successful brand in Australia?
I think the other thing you've got to remember is currently there's 69 brands in a market of 1 million versus 69 brands in a market of 17 million in the US. That means not all brands are enjoying probably prosperity or returns that they would like to see. As a consequence, I think it's difficult to say that there wouldn't be brands that wouldn't withdraw from that viewpoint. I'm not privy to any brand's plans, so I have no internal information. But in just simply looking at the macro picture, I would imagine that some would be, basically have that as one of their options if it got too difficult.
But Toyota's determined to stay and keep doing good business in Australia.
We've basically got a great base here in Australia. People trust us. Our business model is working. Doesn't mean that we're complacent whatsoever with ourselves and our dealers, but we're certainly not going anywhere.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
No worries, Senator O'Neill. I'll just ask with a concluding question before we finish. Can I ask Mr. Callaghan, chat, keep doing this, I'm very sorry.
That's okay.
I wanted to ask, in the context of the mandatory principles versus voluntary principles, you said very strongly that because of a robust relationship with your dealers, that they are not necessary. Nevertheless, that you're opposed to them. In what way would they, if you've got a robust relationship, in what way do they represent a risk to Toyota?
What we're saying is currently we don't have any requirement for them as Toyota. I think the other thing that Simone mentioned was the change in the code has only just taken place in June. So we believe it's preemptory to make further changes until we can actually see what the result of that would be. So from our viewpoint, we just think that things also can morph depending upon how they're written as well into the future. So the business models are going to have to change into the future. Ours firmly has our dealers within our business model, but both ourselves and our dealers understand we're going to have to also change the way we work as well to absolutely be relevant.
Do you think in that context that making the code mandatory would in effect tie OEMs to in having a business model that will always be centred around a dealership model, and that some OEMs won't find that flexible enough for them?
Again, I'm not really privy to what our competitors, but there is a lot of competitive, this market extremely competitive. 69 brands, 1 million vehicles, and it's not even going to be 1 million this year. So everybody's under pressure.
Yeah, and in that context, it would probably serve Toyota well if, I guess, there are a few dealership models and other people have to innovate in other ways. Do you consider, from your own strategic point of view, that you will retain a dealership model, but that other brands might move away from that, and that will be a relative strength for you?
We think our dealers are a real key strength of ours, so we have no intention whatsoever. But what it does mean, and we have these discussions openly with the dealers, and they raise it with us, is that we have to continue to find ways into the future to jointly add value to what we sell to customers.
Yeah. Which might be something that hasn't been valued in the other dealership models perhaps for some time, which is somewhat ironic given that GM Holden built its entire brand off a strong dealership model and Australian-made cars. So thank you very much for your evidence today. It's been very much appreciated by the committee. Were there any other questions from committee members?
Just if I could on notice, 1,600 employees in Toyota Australia, I think was your evidence. Could you give me an indication of how they're on notice distributed across the country and the sorts of roles that they fulfil, just to get a sense of what an OEM in Australia looks like? And are you a member of the FCAI?
Yes, we are a member of the FCAI. And if we look at the 1,600, approximately 500 of them are actually involved in the logistics side of the business, particularly in parts, which would be the very, very great majority of them, the 500. Those warehouses, or basically Toyota parts centres, we've got one in Brisbane. We have a large one in Brisbane. We have a very large one in Sydney. We have a newly built one in Melbourne. And then on top of that, we have a distributor in Western Australia who has had a long-term relationship with us, and they have a parts distribution. The other 1,100 people are mainly white collar in their natures, and it covers a very broad spectrum.
If I could ask you to review the evidence of the FCAI, because based on my hearing of their evidence, a lot of what they said doesn't actually accord with the evidence that you've given today. It seems there might be a range of views within the FCAI that wasn't accurately represented in their evidence the other day. Thank you very much, Mr. Callaghan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to Toyota Australia for your evidence today, and we will now proceed with our next witnesses.
Thank you.